Welcome everyone to the first official Sunday Slaughter podcast. I'm excited because this is something I've wanted to do for a while now, and because of the support of the patrons, we were able to actually get this thing off the ground. So I'll just go ahead and introduce myself. You may recognize me from the Battle Reports. This is Chris, otherwise known as Bolton Skincare. I have a few of my friends on this episode, and first I would love to introduce my co-host, Charles, if you want to step in here and just give a brief introduction to who you are.
Hey everybody, my name's Charles Traha. I go by Weasel Kingdom. I'm all the major discords and stat sites. Free folk player from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and I'm excited to talk about games.
And then I have two other guests, two special guests, I will add. We have Max and Bob, who are both from my local game store. They're the two individuals that actually got me into the game. So let's start off with Bob and just introduce yourself.
Sure. Bob, Lord Commander Bob. My gaming background, this is kind of like my first, this is really my first tabletop game. So, pretty fun game. I'm loving it. Still loving it for over a year and a half now.
And then last but not least, Max, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hey, everybody. First off, Chris, thanks for having me on. My name is Max, also known as the Iron Cairo in Discords and some different spots around the community. And gaming background, just always been a tabletop gamer since I was preteen, and just jumped in to Song of Ice and Fire when it started as a Kickstarter, and then just never looked back.
As far as my background goes, this is my first tabletop board game. The story goes, I'll just make this quick. I had started just collecting board games in general a couple years ago, and then my sister was just trying to think of a Christmas gift for me, and she went to a local game store where she lives out in Vegas, and then saw that her game shop had the Song of Ice and Fire Kickstarter set just for sale. And she knew that I was a big fan of the books, so she decided to buy that and send it to me. And it actually sat on my shelf for a good 6 months because I just didn't know if there was a community for it. And just one day, I decided to do a little research to see if anyone was playing the game. And turns out my local game store was having a tournament, in a few weeks. And so I called the store, and Max's dad, who owns a store, told me to talk to this guy named Bob. And it's all history from there. I came and I spectated a few games, and I thought it was simple enough. And eventually, I talked to both Max and Bob, and they told me what kind of army would maybe fit my play style. And then, I was sort of hooked from there. Maybe I'll just turn it over to Bob, since he's in a similar boat where this is his first war game. Tell me, what really attracted you to this type of game?
Game of Thrones. It like just flat out Game of Thrones. I was always the type of like, oh gosh, I'll never get into tabletop war games because they're so nerdy. And then, I know I was a nerd anyways, but the whole Game of Thrones theme just attracted me straight out. Had another buddy that didn't have time to play, and he was selling his Night's Watch starter. So like I just snatched that up. Came with a little bit extra from the starter set. I think it came with some Ranger Hunters and a couple, at least one other unit. Oh, it was the Scorpion, and just started playing it. And at the time, it wasn't. We didn't have a ton of people playing it at the time. So I was kind of like playing the same person over and over. It was Night's Watch mirror matches, and then once every couple weekends, we'd meet up at Max's house and play before the game store opened. When the game store opened, we just started playing a lot more at the game store, and people like you, Chris, came in and saw us playing it and started playing with us. But mostly just the theme of the game, the just the category of the game was awesome, and that's what dragged me in immediately.
Nice. And Max, you have a gaming background, and I'm sure that this is maybe one of the long list of tabletop war games you've tried. So let's talk about what caught your eye with this game and how it differs with some of the other games you've played before.
Sure. So, like Bob, it definitely drew me in because of the Game of Thrones IP. So I was a huge fan of the show. I didn't jump in until like I don't know season 5 or 6. People kept telling me I was going to love it, and finally took the leap. And my wife and I just binged the ever loving heck out of it until we were completely caught up by like season 6 or so. So it's definitely the setting that really drew me in at first, but always pay attention to Kickstarter for different miniatures games or miniatures models or stuff like that. And so seeing it on Kickstarter and seeing the way that it was going to be played was really appealing because I played Warhammer Fantasy, which was a rank and flank game, and I loved it. And it stung when Games Workshop took that away. So yeah, it being able to be kind of a spiritual successor to Warhammer Fantasy and providing those that the different houses would definitely play different was a huge draw to me. I was always a fan of the Baratheons and the story from like the historic story, so not necessarily the show, but once I started reading the books, the Baratheon vibe of just these like angry Stormlander, pissed off knights appealed to me. So I couldn't wait for Baratheons to come out and knew that they eventually would. So that was also a big draw for me. So yeah, that's kind of what pulled me into the game and kind of what set it apart from other things on Kickstarter for me.
So what about you, Charles? I don't know much about your gaming background, but are you similar to Max where you played, these versions of Warhammer?
Yeah, absolutely. I bought into Warhammer Fantasy Battles in 7th edition, transitioning into 8th. I played through all of 8th, which is right up to when it died, basically. Had a couple factions. That was my first war game. I was a big D&D head prior to that. Then I played War Machine and Hordes for about a decade before I kind of hung that up in Mark III. And that was largely because a lot of my meta moved. They actually moved to the Pacific Northwest, so we didn't have as many players anymore. And then, see, I'm going to go the opposite here. I did not buy into Song of Ice and Fire in the beginning, very specifically because it was Song of Ice and Fire. Not because I don't love the IP. IP is great. It's a very rich story overall. Um, I usually avoid established IP games because I feel they have a limited design space. You know the factions are going to be, you know what the units have to look like, and it kind of only goes so far. However, two good friends of mine bought the Kickstarter and played the mess out of this game. I saw them 2, 3 times a week playing games, and I realized that mechanically I had to play this game. Like it had some of the best elements of fantasy, some of the best elements of War Machine Hordes that I loved about it, like how your commander super changes the way your list plays, even though it's the exact same roster. Like those elements, and then how much mobility you had for a rank and file game was super interesting for that type of board state game. That I had to give it a shot. And Eventually I was like, man, I just want to play games with these guys. They're two of my good friends, and we don't play any other games overlapping really. At the time, I was actually pushing to build a community for a totally different game, God Tier. I was playing a ton of God Tier. Uh, Probably through the winter Q4 last year of 2019, first Q1 of 2020, playing a ton of God Tier and getting that community going. And then I bought my in the middle of the summer, this summer basically, I bought Ice and Fire. Bought a free folk off somebody because I was torn between what factions to buy, and a guy was same thing was selling a unit, a box, to start a box. I think it's Spear Wives and Cave Dweller Savages. And he was like, "Yeah, I don't have time for this game." And I was like, "Done." Barbarians, Druids, Rangers are my aesthetic for every game I play. I'm a tree hugger on the tabletop more often than not. Rangers, Druids, etc. So I was all in on Free Folk whenever he coughed them up for a deal. So that's kind of how I got a Nice and Fire. And then I didn't look back because the game had so much depth and richness that I just was a lot to chew on, and it really, really was filling that crunch that I needed as far as like actual tactical execution that I wasn't getting from War Machine anymore because I wasn't playing. So it really brought that kind of back into my hobby spectrum real hardcore, which was nice.
It sounds like, with Max being a hardcore Baratheon player, and then Bob obviously being a fan of Night's Watch, and then you, Charles, playing Free Folk. I personally bought into the Bolton faction just because it was just purely on the names of the units. So with units like Bastards Girls and Cutthroats, I was like, I definitely want to field these. I didn't even know if they were good.
Well, I was praying that when they did make the Baratheons, that there'd be big knights with antlers on their helmets and two-handed hammers, and then they gave us that in Stag Knights. and then we got to see their stats, and I was a little let down. But as you remember, the minute the Baratheons dropped, and Bob knows too, I was playing Free Folk, so I'm with you on that one, Weasel Kingdom, and loving Free Folk because of that kind of. It's almost like playing solitaire. Like if you play everything you're supposed to right, the opponent shouldn't really be able to beat you, but you have to do everything exactly right. And I really liked that about that Free Folk style. I like that they didn't have to lean on their cards too much because their cards aren't really that great. So you got to play more on the tabletop, which was playing more into my strength and background in other tabletop games and not being a card gamer at all. But I knew I wanted to play the Baratheons because I wanted that knight aesthetic and everything, and they gave me that. So it is a great game because you can find things you love about it even if maybe it isn't exactly the playstyle you like. I'm usually a very aggressive gamer, but the cool thing was with a lot of the Stannis side of that faction, I'm still able to play aggressively, even though the inherent style of the faction is more of a counterpunch faction. And it just requires some creativity in the way you want to build a list. So I think that's a really, really great part about the game is lending to what you're saying, that the game really allows you to pick a faction that you feel for and that you kind of thematically can tie to. And then there's enough commanders that alter the way that the army plays that you're going to be able to mold the faction to play the way you want to, assuming you're having fun playing them. And that's what I think is really great about it. I'm not like, oh well, you're aggressive so you have to play Starks. No, you can be aggressive and play Lannisters with the mountain. You can be aggressive and play Stannis side Baratheons. You can be aggressive and play Free Folk that way too. It's just how you want to play it and what you want, what you feel attached to, from an aesthetic, and from a, their theme if you're coming from the show. So yeah, I completely would say that it's a great game because of that.
And that makes total sense because, with Bob being our resident Night's Watch expert and him looking so much like Donald Noy that he would be attracted to, a faction like that.
Wow.
You can't deny that you don't look like him. Just a little bit.
I mean, remember, you were supposed to get me a costume and you didn't do it. So
Yes, that a little insider information when I think it was, now I can't even remember which battle report it was, but it was around Halloween, and I was gonna have Adam dress up as Steer and Bob dress up as Donald Noy, but we were trying to find like the crappiest costumes that we can find on Amazon. Unfortunately, it didn't work out, but there's always this year.
yeah, maybe the patrons will demand it this year.
Well, let's talk about your choice into buying into Night's Watch. Was it just a matter of you coming across the army to buy, or was there something about that faction that really drew you to them?
No, it was definitely the fact that it was available for me to buy at the time. I didn't really want to get into the game buying a multi-faction starter set, which was the Lannister and Stark, obviously that starter. But it was kind of Max was telling me how great it was. It was such an easy faction to get started with. It makes it easier to learn the game. It was more forgiving, which I still agree with that. I totally think it is a more forgiving faction, but you can also learn some deep down details that makes them very, very powerful as well. It's hard for newer players to beat them because they are so forgiving until you learn kind of the details of what they're weak against, what time to plan your attack, and that's one of the coolest things about the game. You kind of figure out how to play each faction, how to counter each faction, and every faction has a way to counter at least a little bit. So you kind of have to figure those out, which is pretty cool. And like I said, with Night's Watch, they're like a Swiss Army knife. They have Othel, who's very aggressive. They have Alistair, who has the control aspect of it. Donald Noy, who has the defensive Baratheon-like style. Then you have Jon Snow, who's the really forgiving commander. And what am I missing? Am I missing any of them? Oh yeah, you have Gior, who is kind of like the morale booster if you need to go up against, like, I don't know, Melisandre or something like that. If you need a list for high morale, it's really cool because the vow mechanic is pretty awesome. It's a lot of fun. It takes some strategy to learn how to use it. You can use it. You can be very powerful with it once you figure out certain things, like little things like Watcher on the Wall. A lot of people forget that you can get that free retreat with it. You free retreat with a Sworn Brother unit or something, and go smack something else in the flank. It's really really cool. But yeah, it definitely hooked me into the game. Starting off playing Night's Watch versus Night's Watch wasn't that fun, but it helped me learn the faction even more. So it helped me learn how to beat them in a mirror match as well. So yeah, I mean, it. I'm branching off into other factions as well now. I like Lannisters a lot. I like the control style. So Alistair's obviously one of my favorites for Night's Watch. But yeah, it's a really cool faction to start out with, and it definitely hooked me in the game pretty quickly.
And that's really a great segue, because one of the things that I definitely wanted to talk about is, what is everyone's opinion on the faction to start with if you're trying to, teach someone the game or bring them into the community? Because I'm sure there's going to be some people that are listening to the show that may have gotten the game for Christmas, or they have their game sitting there and just waiting for some of these restrictions to be lifted so they can start playing again. So let's start out with Charles, and what is your opinion on a good beginner faction for some of these players?
That's a fair question. So kind of like I think it was Max who said it is you can kind of play everything in every style in this game to some degree. They gave you at least one commander option for pretty much every play style. If you don't have a hard control guy, you have a soft control guy. If you don't have a full aggro, you at least have some combat mechanics that he increases. You have something. Um, I think Lannisters is actually a fair starting point if you're talking about the 2-player box. I think they're a more accurate measurement of what playing other factions is going to feel like. And then I do think Night's Watch probably is the best starter box to learn to play the game, strictly because Night Watch is a very mid-range faction. They have some great elite units, some great skirmishing units, but they also have solid ranged. Their cards do a little bit of everything. They have some card draw. They got some buffs, some debuffs, some reactivation tricks, some out of activation movement. Pretty much one of every major card type, right? Like not everybody has Swift Advance, but like they do have Watch on the Wall. They have a way to reactivate. They have a little bit of counterplay, a couple of debuffs. They do pretty much have one of everything, which is also why I think Lannisters is a good example as well. They're known as the Panic faction, but they have counterplot, so it's the introduction to control. They have the mountain in the core box, so he's got from tactics board charges, extra attacks. He's got overrun, as well as another combat trick steroid that shows you to care about proximity or choosing which units get the buff because they get better secondaries. And Lannisters also introduced the importance of picking the tactics board in terms of what your army list does, not necessarily what the tactics board does in a nutshell by itself. So I think those two are probably the most accurate to learn how to play the game.
And then, sort of conversely, Max, what do you think is the worst faction to throw a new player into?
Free folk, far and away. Followed probably by neutrals. Even though neutrals are kind of a Swiss Army knife, they're just squishy. So they're not as forgiving, and we keep talking about factions that have forgiving natures. I completely agree that, to me, Night's Watch would be like the Space Marines. If anyone's coming from a 40k background, they can do a little bit of everything, as Bob mentioned, and you get the triggers for their cards always come up. So it's like start of a turn, when you attack, when you get attacked. So it's very easy to play their cards. So for a new player, they're not going to be trying to shoehorn an opportunity to get to play their cards. They just get to play them. That's also true of the Lannister cards. So what you'd mentioned before, that's really good with the Lannister one. And I think you also need to know where the person's coming from, because if they're coming from a card gaming background, Lannisters are perfect for them because you get to play those cards, but they have some cleverness to them and nuance. Where if someone's maybe like more tabletop game, they've played Warhammer 40K or something like that, maybe Night's Watch might be better because of the way they play on the table, and you don't have to think as hard about your cards. You're just going to be able to sling them. But yeah, Free Folk, because well, right away, at least in the current rendition of the game, you got to buy 2 starters to really make them effective. That used to be when I first was playing Free Folk and they first came out. That was the only way to play them. You basically bought 2 starters, got rid of 2 of your giants, and then just rolled them out there with a ton of insignificant in the old school Mance Bomb before they adjusted the way NCUs could pass with Wildling Diplomacy. But Free Folk are just very, very, very challenging because you make one wrong move. I mentioned it before, they're almost like playing solitaire, in that you make one wrong move and it can be very early in the game and it can just spell doom for the entire game. I will also say that though they have the highest floor, they probably have the highest ceiling in the game. Playing as Free Folk, I've definitely played games where the minute I got my machine rolling, I felt like my opponent couldn't win. There was nothing they could do. That was it. And then there were other times too where I was playing against Free Folk and I was, rolling my neutrals out there and felt like, boy, if this Free Folk player plays everything the way he's supposed to, there's not going to be anything I can do to actually beat him. But you have to do everything exactly the way you're supposed to, and that's very challenging. So that'd be my 2 cents. So I'd probably go with Free Folk followed by neutrals. Maybe used to be Targaryens pre-Dragon.
Yeah, absolutely. Free Folk, the learning curve is actually really about pace and space, which people don't quite realize. And there's no real way to cheat that learning curve other than playing on the table. You just have to know where things go. Your opponent, your terrain, everything, the objectives, game modes. Because if you're out of position, you just can't play. You block yourself out. You have too many bodies. And then
I had that problem. Yep.
yeah, and then when your flank gets crushed, it just gets crushed. It's an avalanche from there. So that's what's probably makes them one of the hardest. I agree because it's just the mechanic that you have to learn them with the game is actually the one that's just about time and repetition. And new players don't always have that yet, right? They're trying to decide if they want to dedicate time and repetition to the game. It's kind of hard to start with that with your folks.
And that's definitely something I've learned because I'm playing as Free Folk in the World Cup, and I've gotten a handful of practice matches in, some of which with Weasel, but like I mentioned to someone, piloting Free Folk is like an art form. Like it even starting with deployment, I'm running spam lists, and then I've totally blocked myself out even in deployment where it's like I didn't really consider the space that I would need. Like these are seemingly rookie mistakes, but there's a lot to consider with that faction, and so I totally agree that maybe it's not the best one to start throwing newer players into. And so just switching gears here, we of course have changes coming down the line regarding the rule book, a new faction. Let's start off with Bob here, and just maybe let me know what you're most excited about that's coming around the corner with these changes in 1.7.
So this might be weird because I'm a Night's Watch player, and I think it really hurts Night's Watch. Depending on any other changes, I guess I can't really say if you put it into place right now, it would murder Night's Watch. But the 5-card hand limit, I think it's going to make things a lot more strategic. I think it's going to focus a lot more on the playing field versus trying to get every single card in my hand. I think it also when I play against Night's Watch and they have every card in their hand, everything's predictable. It's so easy to predict when they have all their cards. I think it's going to add a little bit of element of surprise for Night's Watch as well, and other factions that draw a lot of cards. Baratheons with their NCU, Lannisters can draw a bunch of cards as well. I really just think it's going to be more strategy based on what you keep in your hand versus what you're discarding to try to get something else. any aspect of more strategy in the game, I'm all for, and I think this is one of them, and I'm pretty pumped for it.
And speaking of cards, that seemed to be a popular thing within Facebook, because I actually asked this question to the community. What people are most excited for, and quite a few people stated the new card packs and the card play that exists in the game is really a big component of what makes this game different from other tabletop war games. So Max, what do you think about spicing it up with these new card packs and how that'll affect the game?
I think it's going to be awesome. I think that when the decks first came out with the units that were first available, they were great. But it also, I think what Simon realized was that if you make the deck too good, it limits the types of units you can release, because the deck can make the unit overpowered or underpowered. So those initial early decks, especially the first three, I guess even the neutral one you could say, but I'm going to go with the Starks, the Lannisters, the Night's Watch especially. You look at them and you just see that they're so synergistic with the faction, and they're easier to play those cards, and you get those power hands where the one card rolls into the next, like the Sudden Charge, Devastating Impact, Northern Ferocity action, stuff like that. That it's really cool when it's isolated, but all of a sudden I think they realized that it limited their design space for units, because all of a sudden those cards paired with some of the later units that showed up, like the Tully Cav, let's use that as an example. All of a sudden, just it's overwhelming. You all of a sudden get hit by heavy Cav with those cards paired up, and it's devastating, to use it as a pun and a card. But I think I'm excited because you can see where they noticed that, and then they pared down the decks. I think that the Free Folk deck is intentionally a little bit clunky, because I think they know you're going to have so much to handle with just moving your units around on the board that you can't possibly also manage complexity within your card deck. But then with the Baratheons, with the Targaryens, definitely what you're seeing coming out of the Greyjoys, you can see that those decks are just a little bit, they're just a notch down from the other ones. But I think that's because it gave them freedom to then create these really fun units in the way that the unit could operate within that design space. I think that paring back the cards a little bit, making the cards not the focal point of the game, but a feature of the game, is going to make those units that they start designing for us, and even these adjusted units, a heck of a lot better. And you know me, Chris, sometimes the creators of the game sometimes can be a little grating to me, but I really, really trust Michael Chanel's ability to create a good, balanced game based on the origination of this game. So I'm really excited to see what he provides for us with these adjustments, with him being back involved, I think, a little closer with the game after stepping away to design some things like Bloodborne.
And I'm sure you can agree, Max, that the Baratheon deck could use a little work anyway. So any Baratheon player that's just waiting on the changes, I'm sure it's just like fingers crossed that it's going to be a lot stronger than what it is currently.
It's a very conditional deck. But at the same point in time, I would say if that's the direction they want to go, that's okay too. I don't mind if my deck even stays pretty much exactly the way it is, as long as each of the decks kind of fills the design space that it's intended to fill for that faction. I don't mind. So whether it means mine needs to be buffed up to match others, or whether it means other ones need to be brought down more in line with the Baratheon deck, I think either way is okay to me, actually. I mean, there's the challenge with the Baratheon deck is you might draw both your counter charges late in the game when everything's already engaged. Nothing like drawing your Stag's Resilience in the first turn when nothing's engaged. Stuff like that. Nothing like drawing Stag's Wit, period. So that's a card that I'm often discarding. Unless I'm playing like Mancer, I guess. Mance or Mance. But so it's just a very conditional deck, and the cards have a timing component to them that's just challenging to make work sometimes. But that's okay, like I said, if that's the way the cards are supposed to play within the game's design space. I don't necessarily think that's wrong. It's just about making sure that it's balanced so that I'm not sitting across the table from you playing Starks and you're just throwing cards at me from the first turn all the way to the last turn. And in that whole amount of time, I maybe got to play 4 or 5 cards across, 4 or 5 rounds.
Turning it over to Charles, you probably have you're closer to the ground when it comes to a lot of these changes that are coming out. Because personally, for me, the Visions and the Flames were all sort of info bombardment, and I was trying to avoid a lot of the conversation surrounding the changes because naturally as competitive gamers, we tend to speculate in the extremes. So with some of these changes coming about, what are you most excited for? Because, like I said, I'm sure you're most up to date with what's coming.
Yeah, so first and foremost, from a strictly nerd perspective, I'm actually excited for Greyjoys because I want to paint the models. I bought all the expanded Kickstarter stuff and everything, even though I'm a free folk player, just have the models because I use them for D&D at a point cost platform, roughly $2.50 a model, and they're strictly a better quality than say Bones and WizKids and other products that are pre-assembled plastic figs for bulk D&D, and they're perfect. So I am hype for like Aquarius themed Vikings to paint for my D&D games. 1000% psyched for those dudes. So shout out to all the Greyjoy fanboys and girls out there because I'll be right there with you painting things up in the hobby channels. But honestly, Cthulhu themed is another good way to look at it instead of Aquarius. But I'm still super hyped for it. The mechanically, from a game state perspective, honestly, is the reveal. I just want the game out. I want it out. I want to go to the new stuff. I want new toys. I want new games. Everybody is so dialed in on the games. From a changes perspective, I just want to see them. I want to play. I want to measure them. I want to debate them. I want to. Speculation's fine and all, but I want to be able to say, "Man, we called it," or "Man, we were wrong," or "Dude, that was really surprising," or "Man, I got rocked on nerfs, but I don't care because that's new and shiny, and I'm gonna roll a whole lot of that." And people are going to be playing so many games. And I, by my very nature, am a binge gamer. And I want to jam games. I just want game after game after game. And 1.7 or 2021.17.2, whatever we want to call it, is going to give me a mega crap ton of games to play with people. And I could not be happier about the surge and new players who got Christmas toys who are waiting for the rules change, and veterans who've been on the bench through Q4 because there's a lot of guys I haven't gotten to play with since I joined TTS because they were already burnt out from playing events, and I am all ready to just come in there and just like check these dudes at the dice tray and let's go. Let's roll dice and talk trash. It's hashtag trash talk season, and it's time to go.
I love it.
I'm gonna elaborate on that a little bit too. You're like a binge gamer. I am as well, obviously, but I'm looking forward to new list building. I mean, that is, you know how much time when I first started playing this game that I built lists. I'd just sit in bed on the War Council app while my wife's falling asleep and just lists nonstop. And right now it's kind of monotonous list building at the moment because the game's been out so long. And and I just want to sit there and have the time suck of building lists nonstop and trying new ones out and not knowing everything that's going to be the best and you have to include this. I want to find that stuff out for myself again. That was the most fun that I had, is figuring out what people are afraid of the most, what lists I can build that someone goes, oh god, that's going to be a nightmare to beat, without seeing stats or anything on it. It's all going to be brand new. They're going to build up over the time, obviously, but it's all new stuff that I can sit there and just try to find different synergies, and that's going to be so much fun for me.
Yeah, absolutely. At our shop, we call it the dojo. We spend a lot of time just sitting outside in front of the shop on the little bench in front, and we just dojo. We don't even play the game. We've played a dozen games in our head just outside, shooting the breeze. The store's closed. We've been in the parking lot for 40 minutes, still debating a list tech, standing around our cars like a bunch of mooks in the parking lot. But that's still some of the coolest parts of the game. And when a game is fresh and crisp and healthy, that's some of the best parts about being part of the shop community, right? Is the dojo time, even though we don't get to play that many games. Because if only 3 of you show up, one of you really plays a game, 2 of you play a game, one of you sits and watches. Well, you still get all that dojo time after. That third person is still super included, right? And that's a big part of community building. That's a big part of teaching people the game, coaching your newer players. As the veteran, you can sit out, watch the game, mentally play the chess game, and then spend hours talking about that game and unpacking it later. That's what the reveal is going to give us again. And I am super, super hyped to argue with so many people on the Discord servers about the dojo.
And when we talk about just balance, the word balance in general regarding these changes, personally, I think with the removal of NCU commanders and buffs to attachments, I'm really hoping that we see variation in lists that really rely on the attachments, because that's one thing that I just noticed after playing the game for a couple months, that I buy into these attachment boxes, or I start painting these models up, and I'm like, when is this ever going to see the table? The game needed sort of a shakeup in the point cost of units and attachments, to where you have to sort of incentivize people to start taking those. You have cool characters from this lore, and they never see the table. More Vargo. I just want to feel Vargo. That's it.
Hey man, Vargo is rocking out Elo events.
Let's just briefly talk about how TTS has changed the gaming environment. Obviously with the pandemic going on, I sort of see Tabletop Simulator as a blessing and sort of a curse, because Bob, you brought up the fact that there are players that have sort of min-maxed these optimal lists, and then that's sort of all we're seeing right now. Whereas if we weren't going through a pandemic right now, there'd be more people playing on the table. The local metas would be a lot more varied, but with everyone sort of migrating to the safest way to play the game, which is online. How have you really seen, the sort of the game state be altered by the availability of TTS?
Yeah, and I think Max will be great to talk on this too, because he doesn't play on TTS, and it's kind of a counterpoint. I think he kind of feels the same though, because a bunch of us that do play at Gamers Haven do play on Tabletop Sim, and it takes away that aspect that I mentioned earlier in list building of figuring out what is powerful. You have all these games readily accessible online that you can consistently play almost whenever you feel like it. If you schedule games ahead of time, which I see a lot more people do. I know you do it, Chris. You schedule games the night before, for the next morning, or like the next Saturday morning or the next evening or something like that. But it takes away that aspect of figuring things out. Now, on the flip side, it has made me a way better player. I'm able to play against some of the top tier players and figure out some of the things. There's a lot of things that I see that I've never seen playing in person, like, I don't know, super defensive play, which isn't really fun, to be honest. And that's probably why we don't see it in person, because when we go play in person, we want to just butt heads and see a bloodbath. But it really does take that aspect away, especially I think the stats site is really cool to have, but it takes away that figuring out the game aspect. It teaches you immediately what's the highly winning factions and units and stuff like that, especially now that you can see lists. But yeah, I mean, overall it's great because we can still play and it's keeping the game going. So ultimately it did what I wanted it to do, was to just keep the game going. But it also has that little negative side to it as well.
I'm a super visual person, so what I love about tabletop gaming is like seeing the models you guys have painted, and that whole aspect of the game, and then just the personal interaction. So I really like that part of it. And I just like hanging out with a friend. And of course you can do that through a computer screen too. And I think that what TTS brings is it brings the digital and online community closer, which is really good. For example, I have Weasel in here with us. And like you mentioned, him being your main sparring partner, that's awesome. But I also think that what we noticed is the more that our players started playing on TTS, it was also a little less imperative to play in person sometimes because you were getting your gaming fix through TTS, where before TTS was really a thing, that Sunday slaughter, that was when we all got together to game, and that the game was definitely, at least at our store, and of course COVID created this as well, but the our gaming group was definitely more coherent when there wasn't as much TTS being had. And actually, when Bob first brought TTS to our group, it was just a way for us to play against each other and try out different lists and stuff like that. When our wives were putting the kids to bed, stuff like that. So yeah, mainly Bob's fault. But the other challenge I think there is I've noticed on TTS a lot of times they'll let you play with spoiled stuff and leaked stuff. And I just think that's a challenge because if it hasn't hit retailers yet, it might not be through its final phase of balancing. And I think that that's really challenging too, because now we've seen with things like the dragons, they've been spoiled. I don't know if they're officially released. I don't think they are. And so I know I've talked to you guys about facing them on TTS pretty regularly, but I would imagine that before those guys really see, true retail, they're going to get adjusted. So that's kind of a piece of it as well. That I think that some of that stuff maybe isn't ready for that. Bob touched on the other piece that it creates its own meta, so it makes it takes a little bit of the thought out of it. That I can just go watch, Brett from Indiana play, and I can see his list, and then I can just run that list the way he runs it. And you can get what you need from watching a couple of his games. If you're a gamer, you know what he's up to, you know what he's trying to do, and what he's trying to create with that list. So it has that as an advantage. But back in the day, that was more of a space for things like League of Legends or World of Warcraft arenas or stuff like that, because you could watch those people play. But tabletop gaming, when you'd have those big tournaments, those big conventions, Adepticon, stuff like that, Gen Con, it's where all these metas would all of a sudden come together and clash, and you would see whose meta came up on top. Now it is
Right.
just a meta. It's a singular meta because of TTS. So what do you think about that, guys?
I mean, that's a great point. And that's something that I've sort of thought about myself. Is honestly, I wish I could go back in time a little bit, or shut this competitive part of my brain off. Since I started playing on TTS and became more involved in these online competitive events, that I wish I can go back and just and still explore, what could be strong, what
You're
not see
neutrals, right?
start. Yes, go back to playing neutrals. That's the main thing. For example, our local meta, there were quite a few people that may still feel this way, but Night's Watch were the top dogs within our gaming group. A lot of people struggled on beating them. And when you look on the stats page, they teeter in the mid tier, always behind Starks, Free Folk, and I believe Lannisters is still above them. But that was like a more innocent time for me before I started playing on TTS. I sort of miss. And uh,
Chris, when we first started seeing that the metrics coming out for Song of Ice and Fire stats, you remember how astonished we were looking at the Baratheon data? Because I was just running the
right,
starter box and neutrals, but I was putting in work with Stannis and some neutrals, and all of a sudden when we got the data and we're like, wait a minute, people think this faction sucks. Our meta was having a hard time figuring me out with. So, but like you said, then all of a sudden you get, one guy figures it out, and if it's on TTS, it's in one of those big tournaments, everyone figures it out.
Yeah. So in some cases, yeah, I'll hop in on this one. I'll just kind of double dutch in, right? So, we had an issue with this. I say issue with this. War Machine is a big competitive circle, right? Everybody who's played War Machine Hordes knows for a long time they hung their hat on being a tournament game, the tournament game, and we played that for a long time. I would say TTS created a similar issue that the online community in general created for itself with War Machine, and that eventually, so for the way War Machine Weekend works, which is effectively Worlds, right, is that it is a qualifier. It is a invitational, and Gen Con, all those things were big tournaments. The winner of those tournaments automatically qualified for War Machine Weekend, and then there was a big last chance qualifier. But because it got well known. A lot of streamers, a lot of major contributors, content creators, people were able to still keep track of what was winning everything, right? So the meta still kind of came into a bubble and solved itself. It just took a little more time. I think the amount of hours people are putting into anything to distract themselves during COVID really accelerated that for Ice and Fire. But and I really think that's kind of what happened there a little bit. Um, I agree with you on that for sure. That it really just kind of helped accelerate the homogenization. Um, like my store has always been a tournament store. We are known for being a competitive store, even among local dealer stores in town. For a long time, for a lot of games, they didn't care for us because everything we did was tournament practice. We would travel to conventions. We would go for not just for War Machine, but for Magic. I played Pro Tour qualifiers. If it was L5R, if it was Netrunner, whatever we were doing, we were going to store champs. We were trying to take your toys and have a good time doing it. And it became one of those things. Our store always runs that, and it's a very delicate balance with your community and building your own local meta that is pretty healthy, especially if there is a skew in the game at the time, and then knowing when to do your actual like I'm going to Gen Con tournament practice. Because when I got into the game, like I said, this was like August. We'll say August this year, not that long. Night's Watch was a terror. In fact, a buddy of mine had Night's Watch and would not play them very much because they felt like they were out of balance with everything else because they could draw their whole deck by turn 2 or turn 3, and all their units were very good, and they beat most armies at face value. And then I bought Free Folk from somebody, and then I won my first 9 games. um, Against whatever faction they put in front of me. It did not matter. They were like, "Oh yeah, we're all playing Baratheons. We're having a great time." They had 2 guys playing Baratheons, and they were doing well with Baratheons. They could not pick up a game against me playing starter box Tormund with Cave Dweller Savages. They couldn't do it. They could not beat one Trapper, a handful of Raiders, and Tormund and Cave Dweller Savages and some Giants. They just couldn't do it. And I picked up the Heroes box. So I did have Harma, I did have Sty, right? So I had like a fairly legit Torment list. But basically it was Hero box 1, starter box, go. And I won my first 6 games. Or so. I think I dropped 1 and 9. And then we had like a little mini round robin tournament. And I dropped both games that day because I had talked them into one guy finally got Rose Knights in. And I had 0 games against Rose Knights and Courtney. So he finally got to play Rose Knights. He won that event. And then I talked the other guy into playing Starks, and he played a Tully list actually, um, and beat the heck out of me because I had no practice in the Starks, because they weren't playing them at the time. They were playing a lot of Lannisters, neutrals, everything else. A couple games in the Starks, and they switched. So basically, me being the guy I was, I already watched a lot of y'all's content and looked at stats and stuff. I was like, man, y'all getting wrecked by free folk. I'm not that good with this situation. You're just playing the wrong list. So let's talk about how you're building lists now, guys, and coach them up. And then our meta changed overnight, right? Stats and TTS, I think, really just accelerated that for a lot of metas because honestly, the minute you get a guy or a couple guys who go to Gen Con who are really tournament minded people, when they go back to their tournament minded store, that store is immediately going to have the Gen Con meta. They're going to say, I got bodied in round 1 and round 2 and scrubbed out of the event. So I got to watch 6 games of the top table. And these are the 4 lists. And this guy won these lists. And this is how it all broke down. And that all comes back over home. And then it just slows it down. I think TTS just accelerated it.
Right. And I guess a little fun fact for our local meta. So, correct me if I'm wrong, Max and Bob, but I think we've had 4 local tournaments, and all 4 were won by Night's Watch. 2 of which were Bob, right?
Is it 4 now? I think one of them was a team tournament and then 3 regular tournaments. But yeah,
Oh, that's right.
because Night's Watch was the first one. I won that one. Then we had a small one after COVID. We had that 10-person tournament, and I won that one. And then we had the doubles tournament, which was a blast. If you guys want to break from like super competitive play, do the teams tournament. And Simon even put out that team tournament document now, which I wouldn't mind trying again soon. And then the most recent tournament we played, it was Night's Watch final. It was myself and Brett in the final there, and it, at that point, it's just like I want to start teaching our store how to beat Night's Watch because I know how people kick my butt You know, I've struggled in the online scene because players know how to beat Night's Watch online. They just do, and especially in Europe, not a lot of people play Night's Watch. I don't think, from what we've seen. So yeah, it does exactly what you just said. I want to teach our store how to beat Night's Watch. I don't want to go in and have everyone expect me to win every single tournament. That's one, that's a lot of pressure, and two, I want them to get better. I want better. I want to play more competitive games, and when we do have big tournaments, I want our store to dominate. You know, so it's funny how the game works, and agree with Weasel. There is, it definitely did accelerate it. I'm not saying I'm not like ragging on stats or TTS or anything like that. I don't want it to seem like that at all. It just did put the gas to the floor on it, you know?
Yeah, because it would have happened anyway on forums and stuff, right? Like people would have just had these long running threads of what was doing what, and it would have got solved out. But
Yeah, and instead of you seeing it last summer, you might have started seeing it this spring, and then
yeah,
1.7's coming out and completely changed, you know?
yep,
So,
yeah, it buys you some time. And also to you guys' point too. Now, a lot of these conversations are about y'all playing a lot of tabletop stuff. I think that's another thing people need to understand as well is when you're coaching your players and you're building your community, is to invest in how they're going to play and where they're going to play. Um, Night's Watch is great on the table. Like we said, for new players, positioning is fairly forgiving. You got a lot of options. You can take one on the chin, you can counter punch. So while you're learning to measure and you're learning all the like chess gambits of like where to position yourself, how to pivot, all that stuff, with no real takebacks because you can't rewind your placement, Night's Watch is a lot better in that environment, dramatically so. Where as much as I love TTS, and it became a necessary evil for bartender to put in the rewind feature, which I'm super grateful for because it keeps the game clean. People were doing it anyway. The constant being able to feel comfortable moving, pivot, move, pivot, which is a lot of game state altering in any other tabletop game, became
Right.
very, very normal in TTS. Even moving 2 units. My first time somebody moved my unit to pre-measure something by moving their unit, I didn't know what to do. Like I had watched enough streams of the games that I was like, oh, this is what they do. Um, but like you're never gonna reach across my table at Gen Con and then move my unit 6 inches so you can then shift two and see if you can shoot me. It's not happening. You can get 2, 3 rulers if you want to. You can figure it out, but I'm not letting you do it. It's not gonna be a thing. Sorry. I just drove, 12 and a half hours from Baton Rouge to Gen Con, which I do every year I can. And that's not happening. It's not how this game is gonna go. But in TTS, you can just, rewind to your previous game state. So that makes those lists that are super, super tuned that have to play a razor thin margin of error to get to that like top 5 percentile playable because you can.
Right.
Where on the tabletop, those will lose a lot more, and they may only be 15th percentile because they're a quarter of an inch out. They're an eighth of an inch out. It literally just isn't there.
Did you guys watch that game that was played between Fabio and Michael Chanel on CMON? Did you guys catch any of that?
I caught a little bit of it. Yeah.
I watched it. Yeah.
So, what I think is interesting, lending to your point, and I remember seeing this on one of Chris's comments when we played a while back, or maybe it was one of the other battle reports. Maybe it was the one Bob and I played, where they were nitpicking on the pivoting and stuff like that. And like you mentioned, I mean, the TTS makes the game an ultra precise game, but by nature, tabletop games aren't precise. You bump the
Exactly.
table, this, that. You're moving them by hand. They're not to a millimeter. It's really not. It's more like to a half an inch. And I, the reason I bring up that Simon game is because if you watch Fabio and Michael Chanel pivot, they're not using pivoting arcs. They're not. It's being played like a tabletop game. It's being played the same exact way I played the game when it first came out for probably the first year until we tried to tighten it up and we'll stick our finger in the middle of the movement tray and try to pivot that way to spin it around and stuff like that. But that precision, I think, belongs a little bit more on the computer and a little less on the tabletop. And I don't mean cheat. I don't mean instead of pivot, wheel your tray or anything like that. I'm just saying that inherently, when you're playing at the tabletop, you're going to lose some of that precision, which is where you then have to decide what type of gamer are you. Are you the guy that looks at the other guy when something's a millimeter off and go, hey, you're out of range? Or are you the guy that goes, we probably bumped the table at some point in time, you're good?
Yeah. To that point, I mean,
You
having
know what I
played,
mean?
yeah, we used to say War Machine's a game of millimeters. It's known for its widgets, right? Guild Ball is the same way. Um, and yeah, I have like an eighth of an inch rule, eighth to a 16th of an inch rule. If I can see that much, 60th of an inch or an eighth of an inch gap, you're just not there. If it's debatable beyond that, you're probably fine, right? For the same reason. And intent. I think it's also big intent where it's like, hey, we agree 18 inches. Yeah, we agree 18 inches. Agree 8. All right, we agree 8. And you're right. TTS takes a lot of that out of it. And like I said, that's what goes back. There's no right or wrong, in my opinion, of those. I've really enjoyed the competitive environment for both. Um, but I do think that that's something that leaders, content creators like us, and the guys who picked up the game previously, who are bringing in people into 2021 and things like that. I really think talking about the break points, and so context matters, right? Stats are great, records are great, elo is great, all that stuff helps you a lot, but you have to be able to put it into context. And that is the top list in the meta, but are you skilled enough to pilot it? If the answer is no, play the one you know. You're going to always play the one you know better because you've got the most practice with it, you're the most familiar with it. You're going to miss the least triggers. Oh, like World Cup, I'm going to switch to Starks. They're top tier right now, but I only play Baratheons for the last 9 months. You probably should play Baratheons because you're going to miss your Stark triggers. You're going to miss measure. You're going to forget ranges. You're going to forget all these little things that are going to equal to you probably getting tabled because you're going to be overextended and get your stuff pushed in. So it's up to people who are coaching people and building communities to help apply some context to these players where they don't feel bad for who they lose to. They feel good about what they're playing. They're excited for their lists because they're coached in such a way that builds on their skill set and how to play, versus just, hey, this is the meta, you should do it or you're gonna get wrecked. Well, not really. Um, if my opponent's playing top tier meta stuff but doesn't know how to pilot it, I'm probably gonna beat him. So I think that that's a real important thing, like you're saying, like context matters. Online play stats are going to be a bit different than tabletop stats, and individual players' ability to be that accurate all the time. Tournament fatigue, man, we play these tournaments over 7 weeks. You know what I'm saying? Play 5 rounds in 7 hours. Call me later. Your brain's fried.
Right. Let's move on to the next and final topic. We just sort of mentioned the World Cup that just started this week, and I just wanted to do some quick breakdowns of the stats, and I would like to actually get Max involved in on this because out of the four of us, he's actually not playing in it. But I've got the North America stats right now, and Max, can you guess what the top three factions that are being played right now?
Okay, top three. Stark's Land. Is Mountain That Rides legal?
No,
Stark.
no, it's
No,
not.
he is not.
Wait,
Non-Kickstarters.
Oh, okay. Well, that makes it a little harder for me to guess, but I guess I would have. Top three factions being played.
Before you make that
Dragons
guess,
are legal.
yes, dragons are legal.
Okay, so probably Targs with dragons, Trapper spam free folk to deal with said dragons, and Starks.
So I was actually quite surprised when I saw these stats when they were released. So it's 27% Night's Watch, tied with 27% Starks, and the third faction is Targaryens at 13%. So just to let you guys know, again, I'm playing Free Folk, and the sole reason why I played Free Folk is because I thought dragons were going to be a problem and Starks. So Starks, obviously, they're at the top of Night's Watch, but I'm quite surprised that Night's Watch is tied with them right now. What do you think, Bob and Charles?
Yeah, I mean, I'm normally Night's Watch player. I kind of this kind of goes back to the list building monotony that I'm in right now. Yeah, I could try some of the new stuff with the new attachments or the whole new Scorpion stuff, but I decided just for the heck of it, play Starks. I don't know how I'll do. Like Weasel said, I might miss some of my triggers. I might screw up a little bit, but I decided just for the hell of it, why not? I wanted to play something a little bit different, and that kind of has taken me back to the fun of the game part of it and trying to figure things out. Um, I'm not going into this expecting myself to finish in the top 5. I went into it wanting to try something new and play a different style and just see what happens with it. Everyone thinks Starks are so powerful right now, and uh, I'm times. I mean, it's not a brainless faction, that's for sure. You still have to be strategic. You can't just kamikaze into units and expect to just blow them up and survive yourself. Um, and I kind of found that out the first couple games that I've practiced with them. But it, I'm surprised. I guess I shouldn't say I'm surprised. I'm not surprised Night's Watch is up there because in the U.S., Night's Watch has always been a top played faction. Um, like I said earlier, in Europe, it's not. And Free Folk isn't played a lot in the US from what we've seen. So that doesn't surprise me. Targaryens being up there, I think lends to the dragon play. But I mean, even that's only 13%. It's not really like an overwhelming amount.
So what about you, Charles? Were you surprised that you and me and one other person were the only free folk players coming out of America?
Yeah, I expect to see a few more free folk players, but after I thought about it, it made a little more sense. Like we mentioned earlier, free folk is not as plug and play as people often think because they look at mediocre units and they assume that means very simple play style, right? You're playing some super bottom basement, free triggers, and then you know vanilla stats from there. It should be pretty easy. And then you realize that roughly a third of the game is card play, and half your games you never touch your hand because you just can't draw enough cards, and most of them are trash kind of thing. I see that discouraging some free folk players, and that made sense. Um, Dragons, I kind of predicted less than people thought because people were going to protest not play them because they just either A, they're not fun, B, they're not fun for their opponents to play against in some cases. But I think mostly C, they still just lose to Starks, and it was the same problem they had before. So they went back to, well, I might as well play the faction I know the most, as I mentioned, because they're least likely to misplay. And they at least feel like they have a chance into Starks in some other lists because they can then just be a better pilot than their opponent is, which I think is the right play. They bet on themselves and their skill set, which I think is
Mm-hmm.
very important, which I think is a real big call. So the like of free folk surprised me a little bit. But everything else more or less shook out. I did predict a higher night watch count of other things. What surprised me was Lannisters. There was more Lannisters than I thought was going to show up, even though there's only like 5, I think, or something like that, 5 or 6. Because mammoths are such a problem for them, dragons are such a problem for them, and there was no mountain that rides. So there are some guys really betting on their overall skill set with Lannisters to carry them, which I think is important. I do think is really important, and I'm kind of excited to see it. It's a very well-rounded field. There was more Baratheon players than I thought that was going to show up. Um, you know, uh, but yeah, no, I did not expect Night's Watch to be second highest. I expected them to be a little bit further behind, but overall, interesting mix.
So, and now if we look over into the European stats, so for those who don't know, the World Cup is actually separated into North America and Europe. It's actually quite different. So at 35%, we have Starks, and then 21% we have Baratheons, and 21% we have Lannisters. Again, pretty surprising that the mountain that rides isn't legal, but people still want to run Lannisters in this meta. And then there's only one Targaryen player, which I found pretty interesting. One thing I'll add is the Stark meta, I would actually consider right now is a European meta. I think it sort of started with the Germans. I could be mistaken, but the first time I saw the optimum list being played was from a German player named Larks. So maybe the Europeans are really relying on what's proven to be strong, and less of speculation with how dragons have performed on TGS over the past couple weeks. What do you think about that, Bob? Do you agree that the Starks were sort of that sort of originated in Europe, that meta?
Definitely, because I mean, last summer-ish, maybe even before that, um, yeah, the triple NCU as well, kind of came from there too, because we always played two. Uh, But as far as the Starks go, I remember I was coming in and saying all these guys are running 3 dogs, high activation Starks, and I'm telling it to our Stark players at Gamers Haven, and they're like, oh, I'm not going to run that. That sounds lame to me, And nobody ran it, and I think they continued to not run it because they didn't want it to become that way. That's not the style they wanted to play. If they wanted to play a horde army, they were going to play free folk, and not many people seemed interested in playing the horde armies at Gamers Haven, at least. I know Max did and Brian did for a while, but that's about it. I think they were our only 2 free folk players for the longest time, until free folk was like the only starter set you could get for a while. But yeah, it definitely came from TTS and Europe. As far, I don't know if that would have ever reached the US if not for Tabletop Simulator.
I mean, what do you think about those stats, Max? So Stark's overwhelming 35%, and then Lannisters being second.
Well, Starks, I mean, I think that a lot of people just like the Starks too. So I try not to just lean into the fact that it's a, power gaming meta and everyone's just trying to win. Like the Starks are just cool too. Like if you're a fan of Game of Thrones, you probably like the Starks and you probably don't hate them even if you don't love them. So I think that the Starks are always going to be popular. Where the Lannisters, I mean, like if you're a fan of the Game of Thrones series and you're coming to this game and you've never played tabletop games before, you're not going to jump on the Lannister bandwagon too quick. That faction seems almost more designed for gamers, where you look at it and you're like, oh, this is a clever faction. This is fun to play. But
Right.
you're not, you know what I mean? So I think that's why the Starks are always going to be popular. I am surprised to hear that the Baratheons are being heavily played, because certain things that I look at in today's meta, like are the Mammoths allowed in the World Cup?
Yes.
Yes.
So the Mammoths and the Dragons both pose what I would consider a pretty heavy issue for the Baratheons, because with relative lack of mobility, when that Mammoth rolls right through your line, you now have a problem getting around back to deal with it. But maybe you'll see some champions of the stag roll up so that you've got that maneuverability to handle those. Or I don't know, maybe our solo or something. But it's certainly interesting to hear that data. Obviously, the Stark piece doesn't come as a surprise, but the Europeans do seem to get out in front of the competitive aspect of this game a little quicker than us Americans do. That seems to have been the case from the very get-go, huh?
Yeah, definitely. I feel like as an American who started playing in these international events, I've had to change my play style when it comes to these matches. Where, for example, there was a match last night. It was the first stream match for the World Cup, and it took what 4+ hours, and I was like, "How is this happening right now?" Like, I mean, that would never happen, obviously, in real life, but that's just the way that the Europeans sort of play. They measure every single thing. They plot out their turn, and that's it just makes for longer games. Before we close out, Charles's last thoughts on the European meta. Max, if you were playing in this event and you're playing Baratheons, what is your 2 lists? What are the 2 lists you're bringing?
I'm probably bringing the Courtney control list, just to deal with some counter. That would possibly rival a Roos with Stannis loyalty, just for picking off dogs. Where you use Roos, Axel, and Mel, and that one really tends to handle that high activation Stark list really nicely. So you got Axel there to snipe the dogs with Roos laying out the counters. Mel's there to bomb the fact that usually those high activation Stark lists don't have a lot of high morale, so you usually can chew them up. And then you just throw a lot of like cutthroats and wardens on the table. A couple of bastards girls with Red Priestess, because I'm a prick. You know me. That list also competes with my Stannis list, which is essentially the same exact thing. But I run Shira in that one, and then Stannis is in one of the units of Bastard Girls. Or no, I'm sorry, it doesn't run. Or yeah, I run Shira. So it's Celise and Shireen, Shira, and Mel as the 3 NCUs, and then you're rolling Stannis into some bastards girls and fleshing it out with wardens and cutthroats. So me, I still try to play a high activation game. That comes from the fact that I played Free Folk before Baratheons came out, so I got to see the value of high activations earlier than everybody else in our group did. So I still try to play into that a little bit, but yeah, I'm probably bringing the Roose one to deal with the high activation Starks, and probably bringing the Courtney on Renly's side for more of that control style of play. That one's really specific though on how that would, who you're going to run that against. You're just running that against factions you have to control and that aren't going to somehow get behind you, because if they do, you got a huge problem.
All right, so Charles, maybe turn on your analytical brain right now and let me know, what are your thoughts on the EU meta? Why do you think there's such a difference?
All right, so back to context. One thing, World Cup, it's a qualifier for the finals. World Cup doesn't happen, it gets rewarded at this regional, it gets handled at the finals. For the most part, we know finals is going to be a top 16 tournament, roughly 8 and 8, because there's only 2 brackets. So you only got to make the top 8, which means you pretty much have to win 4 games. You're guaranteed the top 8, and then you're probably in the finals. Take that into consideration, and the issue of Starks still beats Dragons. Free Folk still beats Dragons. They probably bet on not a ton of Free Folk, so they took their best faction matchups into Free Folk and Starks, which makes the Baratheon choice a little weird, but makes Lannister's count make a lot more sense. Because High Sparrow and Tyrion are a problem for both those factions. So you're beating 2 of the 3 in your paper rock scissors matchup with Lannisters. And Baratheons, you see the same thing. The common denominator is counterplot. What makes Mother of Dragons busted is constantly tutoring for and recycling Fire Made Flesh. Counterplot's a real big deal here. You look at things like was it defensive strategy or whatever it is from Courtney as well. Blanks a unit, takes to the other sales, cancels tactics cards, and things like that are all real big meta plays. That gives you the best chance, both those type situations, at beating easily 60 to 70% of the top playing field, making your 4 wins as the better player more likely than people just playing the meta list. I think you see the French Masters was won by Free Folk. Mother of Dragons plays very high, but the majority of the dilution was still Free Folk, Stark, Mother of Dragons. And Mother of Dragons still couldn't close because Free Folk were better, and they lost a lot of their games to Starks. Australians, same thing. A lot of big Stark players. They play a lot like the Germans do. Mother of Dragons, I played against the Oxus a while back. And same thing. I was like, man, everybody's choosing their mom and Mother of Dragons. He's like, dude, he's playing Targaryens in an Eli event. He's like, I keep playing Mother of Dragons into our tournament practice group, and I cannot get a win. And he's like, yes, but of the 7 players, 5 of them play top tier Starks. And Mother of Dragons cannot buy a win. And Deoxys is a top 15 ranked player, like at the time. So I think you see the Europeans took the stat side seriously. They took their own results seriously. They have a Spanish Masters event that just recently happened that I don't know all the Spanish results for the super regional stuff they did. French Masters has already had a lot of Stark players in it, and it was won by a Free Folk player. And Mother of Dragons had kind of they crushed everyone they should have beaten anyway, like Baratheons, things like that. And they struggled against Free Folk and Starks, which is what you need to beat to win. And if you can crush neutrals, Night's Watch, and the Mirror, Baratheons, that's not enough to win a tournament. You have to take your list that is your best shot at beating 5 rounds of Starks and Free Folk right now. They are still the gatekeepers, or Mother of Darkness even. So if you can duck a Mother of Darkness, but you can beat Free Folk or Starks, you probably win the event, right? I think that's what you see. Mother of Darkness, Mother of Dragons, Mother of Darkness. You're right. I keep saying Mother of Darkness.
No, I mean, you're not too far from the truth. So
Yeah, pretty much, right? Somebody else just messaged me from like our Magic chat, and I got Mother of Darkness is on the brain now. I'm thinking of Planeswalkers, but it's the same problem, really. Mother of Dragons. So MOD. So they just did the math, right? They took their best shot at winning 4 games. If they could beat Starks, 50-50, they're fine. They beat Free Folk 50-50, they're fine. Duck Dragons, and you probably win. I think that's what you really see. That's what the European data came down to, and I think that's the play call you see. The strength of counterplot, blanking abilities, and eliminating the tactics cards from the top 3 factions. Because if dragons can't play Fire Made Flush, if Starks can't play tactics cards, or they lose Hours of the Fury, Free Folk lose Insignificant, things like that, you have a fighting chance. So you see a major influx in factions that can do that. Starks, Lannisters, Baratheons.
Yeah, so if people want to stay up to date with the progress that we are doing throughout the World Cup, go to ASoIAF-stats.com, and all the info on the league standings will be on there. Closing out the show, I definitely want to thank Max and Bob for coming on. They're frequent contributors to the channel. I could not do it without Max and Bob and the rest of my local gaming crew. And also thank you to my co-host Charles for coming on. I hope that people really enjoyed this first episode. I definitely finally want to give a huge thanks to all the patrons of Sunday Slaughter. I'm just going to quickly read off the list right now. So we have Matthew Austin, Dave Meckler from Small Council Radio, another great podcast surrounding the game, Brent Russell, Greg Vizacco, Lord Randall, Murray, Linus, Sir Tubbs, Steve Hamill, Tim Hahn, Josh Carson, Charles, my co-host, Benjamin Lynn of Blitz Minis, and Stephen Newhouse Jr. One more thing before we close out. We're closing out season 2 of the Battle Report. So there are 2 more episodes, part 1 of Blackwater Bay, which is going to be coming out this week. And then the following week will be part 2. And then we're on to season 3, which I'm very excited for. We're going to be doing patron submitted lists. So, I'm excited to see what our audience is going to provide for us. And hopefully we can do these lists justice. So stay tuned for that. And thank you for sticking around. We'll talk to you guys later.